The man in seat 1A had not raised his voice once. He hadn't moved, hadn't argued, hadn't caused a single moment of disruption. But the flight attendant still called security had him escorted off the plane and watched him walk down the jet bridge while every passenger in first class sat in silence. He handed over a valid boarding pass. It didn't matter. What no one in that cabin knew, not the attendant, not the businessman who took his seat, not a single person on that aircraft, was that the man they just removed was the new owner of the airline. The gate was already crowded by the time Owen Carter arrived at the boarding area. He moved through the terminal the way most people moved through hallways they already knew well, steady, unhurried, without looking at the departure boards, because he didn't need to. He was carrying a slim leather document folder and a single carry-on bag, both understated, both, worn enough to suggest they had seen real use. His clothes were clean, but unremarkable. Dark trousers, a plain button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, no tie. Nothing about him announced anything. That was in many ways precisely the point. Owen was 43 years old, a single father, and had spent the better part of 2 decades building things quietly. Not quietly in the way people use that word to mean modest or shy, but quietly in the way that meant he had learned very early that the less attention you drew to yourself, the more clearly you could see everything happening around you. He ran a private investment firm that most people in his industry respected, and almost no one outside of it had ever heard of. He preferred it that way. The deals he made rarely made headlines until long after they were done, and by then, he had already moved on to the next one. The deal that had closed that morning was different in scale from most. He had been working on it for nearly 18 months, and it had required the kind of patience that wore down 3 of his advisors before the final term sheet was signed. He now held a controlling interest in Transatlantic Air, one of the largest mid-market carriers operating out of the eastern United States, with routes spanning the continent and reaching as far as London and Frankfurt. The announcement was drafted and sitting in his legal team's outbox, scheduled to go out the following morning. Until then, there was no public record, no press release, no change visible to anyone outside the small circle of people who had been in the room when the papers were signed. He had chosen to take this particular flight to London because there was a follow-up meeting scheduled for Tuesday with the airline's European operations team, and he wanted to arrive a day early, review the documents he had not yet finished reading and sleep. That was the entire plan. He was not there to inspect anything, not to observe the crew, not to test the service. He had a seat in first class because he had paid for a seat in first class, and he intended to sit in it, open his document folder, and be left alone for the duration of the flight. Seat 1A was a window seat at the very front of the first-class cabin. Owen stowed his carry-on settled into the seat and opened the folder across the tray table before the boarding call had even finished. He did not order a drink. He did not ask for anything. He simply sat there, reading in the particular kind of focused stillness that people who are genuinely absorbed in their work tend to carry. Vanessa Reed was already in the cabin when Owen boarded. She had been working first class on transatlantic routes for 11 years, and in those 11 years, she had developed a thorough and largely unconscious system for reading passengers the moment they walked through the forward door. It was not something she would have described as judgment exactly. She would have called it experience. She noticed the cut of a jacket, the quality of a watch, the way a person carried themselves when they believed they were being observed versus when they thought they weren't. These were the signals she used to decide in those first few seconds what kind of passenger she was dealing with and how much attention they were likely to require. When Owen Carter settled into seat 1, a Vanessa clocked him from across the cabin. Plain shirt, no visible watch document folder, rather than a laptop carry-on, rather than a garment bag. She made her read in about 4 seconds and filed it away. She did not approach him. She moved to the galley to continue the pre-departure preparation, and the boarding process went on around her without incident. Richard Holloway boarded 20 minutes later. He came through the door the way he always came through doors first, and with the particular energy of someone who expected the room to rearrange itself around him. He was in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark charcoal suit that was clearly expensive and clearly chosen to communicate that fact. He had a phone pressed to his ear, a rolling garment bag behind him, and the expression of a man who had been mildly inconvenienced for the last several hours and was prepared to hold the nearest available person responsible for it. He stopped at row 1 and looked at the seat assignments, then looked at the man already sitting in 1A, then looked at his boarding pass. He lowered the phone from his ear without ending the call. "That's my seat," Richard said. Owen did not look up from his document immediately. When he did, his expression was even. "I don't think so," he said. "1A is my seat." Richard held up his boarding pass as though the physical act of displaying it settled the matter. "I fly this route every month. 1A is always mine when I book this flight." "It isn't yours this time," Owen said, and returned his eyes to the document in front of him. It was exactly the kind of response that Richard Holloway was not accustomed to receiving. He was accustomed to negotiation, to the slight deference that people in service industries tended to extend to men who looked like him and traveled with his frequency. He was not accustomed to being answered with 4 words and then ignored. The color in his face shifted slightly. He turned toward the galley. Vanessa appeared at the curtain before he reached it. She had heard the exchange from 6 feet away, and she came forward with the brisk, practiced efficiencies of someone who had handled seat disputes before and knew how to close them quickly. "Is there a problem with your seat, Mr. Holloway?" she asked. Richard turned toward her with the relief of someone who has finally found the right audience. "There is. I have 1A on my boarding pass, and there's already someone sitting in it." He gestured behind him without looking at Owen. The gesture said everything about how much weight he assigned to the man in the seat. Vanessa looked past Richard at Owen. She took in the plain shirt, the document folder, the absence of the usual markers she associated with the passengers who occupied this cabin without question. Something in her calculation shifted, though she would not have been able to say precisely what it was or when it happened. It was not a conscious decision. It was more like a direction she was already moving in before she was fully aware she had chosen it. She walked toward Owen with a careful professional smile. "Sir, may I take a look at your boarding pass?" Owen reached into the front pocket of his folder and produced the boarding pass without a word. It was a printed pass, not a mobile one, and it was clearly marked 1A Transatlantic Flight 274 non-stop service to London Heathrow departing that afternoon. Vanessa looked at it. Then she looked at Richard's pass. They both said 1A. She understood immediately that this was a double booking, a system error, a problem that happened occasionally, and that had a clear procedure for resolution. The procedure involved checking the booking timestamps and honoring the earlier reservation. She did not follow that procedure. Instead, she handed Owen's pass back to him and said in a tone that was polite, but carried an unmistakable suggestion beneath it. "Sir, I do want to make sure we get this sorted out. Mr. Holloway is a frequent flyer with top-tier status on this route. We have excellent seats available in the business class cabin, just behind first class, and I can have you moved and settled within just a few minutes." Owen looked up at her. His expression did not change. "My ticket is for this seat. I'd like to stay in this seat." "I understand that," Vanessa said, "and I appreciate your patience, but given the circumstances, What circumstances?" Owen asked. His voice was still level, but the question was direct enough that it created a small silence in the immediate area. A woman seated across the aisle in 1B had been watching since Richard boarded. She did not look away. Vanessa kept her tone smooth. "Mr. Holloway has a long travel history with us, and in situations like this, we try to—" "His travel history is not a circumstance," Owen said. "He has a boarding pass for the same seat I have a boarding pass for. That's a booking error on the airline's part. The resolution for a booking error is not to move the passenger who is already seated. It's to check the timestamp of the original reservations and honor the earlier one." He reached back into his folder and produced a printed booking confirmation. My reservation was made 6 weeks ago. If you check the system, I expect you'll find his was made sometime after that. Vanessa looked at the confirmation. There was a beat brief but visible where the logic of what he was saying registered and where the correct professional response was obvious. She did not take it. Richard had been standing slightly behind her during this exchange, and the patience he had started with had thinned considerably. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Look," he said, "I fly this carrier more times in a month than most people fly in a year. I think we both know that counts for something in a situation like this." "It counts for frequent flyer points," Owen said, still looking at Vanessa. "It doesn't count for a seat that was already taken." Richard's expression hardened. He stepped slightly forward and lowered his voice, though not enough for it to be private. "I don't know where you're from, friend, but on this route in this cabin, there's a certain understanding about how things work. I'd suggest you not make this harder than it needs to be." Owen set down his pen. He looked at Richard for the first time with full attention, the kind that doesn't require any particular expression to carry weight. He did not respond to what Richard had said. He turned back to Vanessa. "You have my confirmation. You have my boarding pass. Both are valid. I'm not moving." Vanessa straightened. The situation had moved past the point where it could be resolved quietly, and she could feel the attention of the cabin beginning to concentrate on the front of the aircraft. There were 9 other passengers in first class, and not one of them was looking at anything else. That shift in the room, the sense of an audience forming and choosing sides, was something she felt acutely, and it changed her. Not toward fairness, toward conclusion. "Sir," she said, "I'm going to need to ask you to cooperate with this request. We do have the authority to reseat passengers when necessary for the comfort and order of the cabin." Owen's voice remained absolutely flat. "I have not disrupted the comfort or order of anything. I have been sitting here reading since before anyone else boarded." "I understand, but at this point, I'm asking you to comply." "I'm declining," Owen said simply. "If you believe I'm in the wrong seat, escalate it to the captain. But I'm not moving because a flight attendant and a man who arrived after me would prefer that I do." The woman in 1B had now stopped pretending she was looking at her phone. 2 more passengers in the rows behind had turned in their seats. The cabin had gone very quiet. Vanessa left the first-class area and was gone for less than 2 minutes. When she came back, she was not alone. 2 members of the ground security team stepped through the forward door behind her, both in the yellow vests of the airport authority. She stopped in the aisle beside Owen's row and spoke in a voice that was controlled, deliberate, and loud enough to be heard without effort by the entire cabin. "Sir, I've asked you twice to comply with a crew instruction. You've refused both times. I'm asking you to gather your belongings and come with these officers." Owen closed the document folder. He did not argue, did not raise his voice, did not appeal to the passengers watching him. He reached up and retrieved his carry-on from the overhead bin with the unhurried economy of someone who has simply decided that the room is no longer worth the energy it's asking for. He tucked the folder under his arm, nodded once at the security officers, and walked toward the forward door without looking back at Richard or at Vanessa. He walked off the aircraft into the jet bridge, and the door closed behind him. Richard settled into seat 1A. Vanessa straightened her jacket and moved back toward the galley. The cabin held its silence for a moment longer than it should have, the particular kind of silence that follows something that several people in a room know was wrong, but no one said aloud. Owen Carter stood in the jet bridge. It was cool and slightly dim the way jet bridges always were, the light coming from panels above, and the low hum of the boarding equipment still running nearby. He set his carry-on on the floor, opened his document folder, and found the contact on his phone. He made the call. It connected on the second ring. "It's Owen," he said. The voice on the other end responded. Owen let it finish before he spoke again. "I'm standing in the jet bridge of Flight 274. I was just removed from my seat by the cabin crew." A brief exchange followed. "Yes." Another exchange. "I think when you have a moment, We need to have a conversation about the crew currently operating this flight." He listened for several seconds. "I'll wait here." He ended the call. He stood in the jet bridge with the same stillness he had carried into the cabin. He did not pace. He did not take out his earphones or check the departure board. He simply stood there, folder in hand, and waited for what he already knew was coming. Aboard the aircraft in the cockpit, the captain's phone lit up with a call from the corporate operations center. Inside the cabin, the tension dissolved the way it usually did after a disruption. Not all at once, but in stages like air slowly returning to a room that had been held briefly underwater. Vanessa moved through first class with the composed efficiency she had spent over a decade perfecting refreshing drinks, adjusting the overhead temperature panel, doing the small, visible work that communicated to the remaining passengers that the situation had been handled and that normal service had resumed. Richard Holloway sat in seat 1A with his jacket hung neatly on the hook beside him and his phone back at his ear, his posture carrying the relaxed authority of someone who had resolved an inconvenience and moved on. He did not appear troubled by what had happened. He appeared, if anything, mildly satisfied, but the cabin had not fully returned to itself. The woman in 1B, whose name was Sandra, had not reopened her book since Owen was walked off the plane. She was looking at the back of the seat in front of her, with the expression of someone running a sequence of events back and forth in their mind, checking the logic of it each time, and arriving at the same uncomfortable answer. Two men seated in the rows behind her had resumed their own activities, but with a distracted quality that had not been there before boarding. The conversations that restarted were quieter than they should have been for a first-class cabin at the beginning of a transatlantic flight. The room was doing what rooms do when something has happened that no one is prepared to name yet. Vanessa noticed none of this because she was not looking for it. She had made her call, the security team had responded, the passenger had left without incident. In her internal accounting of the event, it was a textbook resolution. Difficult passenger double-booking crew authority exercised, situation closed. She had handled more disruptive scenarios than she could count, and this one had not even escalated to raised voices. She moved to the galley and began organizing the pre-departure beverage service with the same steady rhythm that had carried her through 11 years of this work. Richard, for his part, had already moved entirely past the incident, in the way that powerful men often moved past incidents by absorbing them into a larger narrative in which they were always, in the end, correct. He was aware that the woman across the aisle had been watching him with something that was not quite warmth, but he had long since stopped calibrating his behavior to the reactions of strangers. He was on his phone rescheduling a meeting in London. The seat was his. The flight would depart on time. That was the full extent of his concern. What neither of them was prepared for was what happened 9 minutes later. The cockpit door opened. It opened the way cockpit doors opened on the ground during boarding, normally practically without ceremony. But the man who came through it did not have the manner of someone completing a routine check. Captain Dale Mercer was in his late 50s, a career pilot with the kind of face that long-haul flying eventually produced, weathered at the edges, settled in its expression, not easily moved. He had been flying transatlantic routes for nearly 14 years and had dealt with almost everything the job could produce. He was not a man who hurried unnecessarily or showed agitation without reason, which was why the way he walked through the forward cabin drew immediate attention from every passenger who saw him. He was not running, but he was moving with the purposeful urgency of someone who needed to cover ground faster than walking aloud, without breaking into something he had decided, out of professional discipline, not to break into. His expression was controlled, but could not be called composed. He reached Vanessa at the galley entrance in under 10 seconds. "Where is the passenger from 1A?" he said. His voice was low and even, but there was something underneath it that Vanessa had not heard from a captain in a very long time. The man who was removed. "Where is he right now?" Vanessa kept her voice professional. He's in the jet bridge, Captain. Security escorted him off the— Get him back on this aircraft, the captain said. Right now. Vanessa looked at him. Captain. He was removed for non-compliance with a crew. Vanessa. The captain said her name the way people said names when they needed the other person to stop what they were doing and fully attend. I need you to go to that jet bridge and bring that man back on board. I need you to do that in the next 2 minutes. Vanessa's mouth opened slightly. I don't understand. Owen Carter, the captain said, and the name landed in the galley doorway with a weight that Vanessa did not immediately understand, but felt before she had any explanation for it. Do you know who Owen Carter is? She had not known the name until this morning when the crew roster was distributed with the standard passenger manifest for premium cabin customers. She had seen it on the list. She had processed it the same way she processed every name on that list as a label attached to a seat number, nothing more. He's a passenger on this flight, she said. The captain looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was not unkind, but was absolutely direct. As of this morning, Owen Carter is the majority shareholder of Transatlantic Air. He completed the acquisition at approximately 9:30 this morning. I just had the head of corporate operations on my phone for 4 minutes, explaining that to me. He let that land. The man you had removed from his seat is the new owner of this airline, and he is currently standing in the jet bridge because we put him there. The galley was very small. It felt considerably smaller now. Vanessa did not respond immediately. She was not a person who lost her composure visibly. That too was something 11 years had trained out of her. But the silence she produced in those few seconds was different in quality from her professional silences. It had a texture to it. Something behind her eyes shifted in a way that she could not fully control, and the captain saw it, and neither of them acknowledged it. Go get him, the captain said quietly. Please. Vanessa moved past him through the forward door and into the jet bridge. Owen was exactly where he had been, standing folder under his arm phone in his hand. He looked at her when she came through the door, and his expression was the same one he had worn the entire time, level, contained, carrying no particular emotion that she could read on the surface. She had expected something. Satisfaction, maybe. Or anger that had been waiting for exactly this moment to surface. She found neither. Mr. Carter, she said. Her voice was steady but had lost the professional warmth it had carried throughout the boarding process. What replaced it was something closer to plain. The captain has asked me to invite you back on board. Owen looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. He reached down, picked up his carry-on, and followed her back through the door. The first-class cabin registered his return the way a room registers a change in temperature, not all at once, but undeniably. He walked the length of the aisle without looking left or right, and stopped at row 1. Richard Holloway was in the window seat with his jacket still on the hook and his phone in his hand, and for a moment he simply stared at Owen, the way a person stares at something that should not be there and is trying to produce an explanation for its presence. Owen did not ask him to move. He stood in the aisle and waited. Richard looked from Owen to Vanessa and back to Owen. What's happening, Sotowo? He said. Vanessa said nothing. The captain, who had moved to the front of the cabin and was standing near the galley entrance, was the one who answered. Mr. Holloway. Captain Mercer said, in the measured tone of someone making an announcement that is going to change the character of the next several hours. I want to clarify something for the cabin. There was a seating error on this flight that was handled incorrectly by our crew, and I want to correct that before we push back. He looked across the rows of first class. Every face in the cabin was turned toward the front. Mr. Owen Carter is the confirmed holder of the original reservation for Seat 1A on this flight. He is also, as of this morning, the new majority owner of Transatlantic Air. He should never have been removed from this aircraft, and on behalf of this crew, I want to apologize for that directly. The cabin absorbed this in silence. Richard Holloway's hand, which had been holding his phone, lowered slowly until it was resting on the armrest. Something in his face underwent a change that was difficult to describe, because it was not a single thing. It was several things at once: the flush of embarrassment, the particular deflation of a man who has just understood that the confidence he carried into a room was not actually his to carry, and underneath both of those, something slower and less comfortable that had not finished arriving yet. He stood up from the seat. He did not say anything. He moved past Owen into the aisle, and the captain directed him quietly toward row 2, where both window and aisle seats had remained unoccupied through boarding. Richard took the aisle seat without a word. Owen settled into the window seat at row 1, set his folder on the tray table, and opened it to the page he had been reading 45 minutes earlier. The cabin remained quiet. Sandra, in 1B, had her hands folded in her lap and was watching Owen with an expression that had moved well past simple curiosity. The men in the rows behind were not looking at their screens anymore. The entire first-class cabin had the atmosphere of a room full of people who had just watched something unfair get partially corrected and were holding a collective breath over whether partial correction was going to be enough. Vanessa stood at the front of the cabin. She was doing the thing she always did when she needed to maintain her professional surface, keeping her posture straight. Her hands occupied her face, directed at a neutral point in the middle distance. But something had broken through the surface anyway, and she could feel it in the way she was breathing, which was slightly more deliberate than it usually was. What she kept returning to in those first stunned minutes was not the title or the acquisition or the name the captain had just announced to the entire cabin. It was something more immediate than that. She kept returning to the moment she had stood in the aisle with Owen's confirmed booking in her hand, the timestamp, the documentation, the clear and logical argument he had made, and had found reasons to move past all of it. She had told herself it was procedure. She had told herself it was experience. But the captain's 4 sentences had stripped both of those explanations bare, and what was left underneath them was something she did not have a professional word for. She had looked at Owen Carter and decided before he said a single thing that the situation called for him to move. Not because of anything he had done, because of the picture she had already drawn of him before he opened his mouth. That was not the error. She had made errors before every long career contained them, and she had always been able to locate the version of events in which her judgment had been reasonable, given the information available at the time. The error she was sitting with now was that the information had been available. Owen had provided it. He had been clear and documented and correct, and she had found a way around all of it. And she had done so because the man presenting the evidence did not match the image she carried in her head of who deserved to be believed. Richard Holloway had taken his seat in the second row and was sitting with his hands on his knees and his phone face down beside him. He was not a man who spent significant time in self-examination. His life had been built on forward momentum, on the reliable assumption that the people around him would move out of the way when he moved forward, and that assumption had been correct often enough that he had stopped questioning it. But the captain had just said the word owner in front of 9 other people, and Richard was now doing the arithmetic on what he had said and done in the last 45 minutes, and arriving at a sum that he did not particularly want to see, written out in full. He had told that man, the owner of this airline, that there was a certain understanding in this cabin about how things worked. He had used the word understanding the way people used it, when they meant hierarchy, when they meant stay in the place I've decided you belong. He had implied, without quite saying it, that Owen did not belong in this space. He had stood and watched while a crew member had security remove him from the aircraft. He had sat in the man's seat, the seat Owen Carter had paid for, the seat he had every right to occupy, the seat Richard had taken, because he had been certain, without a moment of real consideration, that he was the one who deserved it. The flight had not yet pushed back. The boarding door was still sealed. The cabin lights were still in their pre-departure setting, warm and indirect, designed to produce calm. But the cabin was not calm. It was the particular opposite of calm that happens when a room full of people is sitting very still and very quietly, and all of them are thinking the same thing, and none of them has said it yet. Owen turned a page. His pen moved across the margin of the document in a small, precise note, the same way it had been moving when Richard Holloway first walked through the forward door and told him he was sitting in the wrong place. The stillness he carried had not changed in character, did not become harder or colder or pointed in any particular direction. It was simply the same stillness it had always been, and in the context of everything that had just happened. That stillness was saying something that no one in the cabin could quite bring themselves to name yet, but that every person in those seats could feel settling into the room like weight. The aircraft pushed back from the gate 11 minutes behind schedule. No announcement was made about the delay. The captain's voice came over the intercom with the standard pre-departure safety briefing, steady and professional, and Vanessa moved through first class with the cabin crew to complete the final checks before takeoff. The routine of it was familiar enough that she could execute it without thinking. Seat belts, tray tables, seat backs, overhead, bins, the same sequence she had performed thousands of times on hundreds of flights on this exact route. Her hands knew what to do. The rest of her was somewhere else entirely. She had been doing this work long enough to know the difference between a difficult flight and one that had gone wrong at a deeper level. Difficult flights had turbulence, medical emergencies, irate passengers, missed connections, and mechanical delays. They were exhausting and sometimes frightening, but they resolved. You landed, you debriefed, you went to the hotel and slept, and came back the next day and did it again. What had happened on this flight before it had even left the ground was different. It did not have the texture of a problem that would resolve with time and distance. It had the texture of something she was going to carry with her for a long time, not sitting on the surface where she could manage it, but deeper in the part of herself that informed how she worked before she was even conscious of making a decision. The aircraft lifted off and the city fell away beneath them. The seatbelt sign remained on through the initial climb, and the cabin stayed quiet in the way that first-class cabins sometimes did. In the first 30 minutes of a long flight, a collective retreat into screens and documents and the particular privacy that altitude seemed to grant. Owen had his folder open again. Richard had not spoken since sitting down in the second row. Sandra in 1B had finally opened her book, though she had not turned a page in 20 minutes. When the seatbelt sign went off and the service began, Vanessa took the cart through the cabin herself, rather than delegating to the junior crew member who usually handled the first beverage pass. She moved from row to row with the cart, and when she reached row 1, she stopped. Owen looked up. She had been thinking about what she was going to say since the moment the captain told her to go to the jet bridge and bring him back. She had turned it over during the pushback, during the taxi, during the climb. She had considered and discarded a dozen versions of it. The professional version, which acknowledged the booking error and expressed regret on behalf of the airline. The careful version, which found language precise enough to communicate accountability without conceding anything that could be used against her. She had been trained over the years in the architecture of airline apologies, structured, measured, legally clean. She did not use any of those versions. "Mr. Carter," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was not performing anything. It was simply the plainest version of itself, which for Vanessa Reed, after 11 years of professional distance, was already something. "I owe you an apology. Not on behalf of the airline, that's the captain's to give, and he's already given it. I owe you one from me personally for what I did before we left the gate." She kept her eyes on him. "You had a valid ticket. You had documentation. You were sitting in your seat, not disturbing anyone. And I made a decision about who you were before you said a single word. And when you gave me every reason to correct that decision, I didn't. I made it worse." She did not look away. "That was wrong. It had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with my own assumptions. I'm sorry." The cabin had gone quiet again. Not the held breath quiet of before, but something slightly different. The quality of silence that a room produces when it is listening because it wants to, rather than because it is waiting for something to explode. Owen looked at her for a moment. His expression had the same quality it had carried through everything. Not cold, not warm, simply present. "I hear you," he said. "Thank you for saying it. That was all." He returned to his documents. Vanessa moved the cart forward, and the service continued. Richard Holloway had been watching from the second row. He had watched Vanessa's apology, the way a man watches something that is revealing to him, with discomfort, with the growing awareness of the distance between who he believed himself to be and what he had actually done. He had spent the climb out of the airport with his phone in his hand, but not using it. The screen dark, his eyes directed at nothing in particular through the window, while the city dissolved into cloud cover below. He had been trying to do what he almost never did, sit still with something uncomfortable long enough to actually feel its shape. What he kept arriving at was not pleasant. He was not a man who had built his life on cruelty. He had never thought of himself that way. He was direct. He was demanding he held high standards for the people around him, and he did not pretend otherwise. He had always told himself that this was simply the reality of operating at the level he operated, at that the world moved faster and required harder decisions, and that the people who couldn't keep up were not his responsibility. He had told himself this so many times, and it had been confirmed so many times by the fact that the world did in fact continue to arrange itself around him, that it had stopped feeling like a justification and started feeling like a law. But there was Owen Carter in seat 1A working through a document folder with a pen, and Richard had told that man an hour ago that there was a certain understanding in this cabin about how things worked. He had said it with the full confidence of someone who knew exactly what the understanding was and exactly where everyone in the room stood within it. He had said it, and he had been wrong in a way that could not be explained away by a booking error or a long travel day, or the pressure of a rescheduled London meeting. He had looked at Owen and decided without any real information where Owen belonged. And then he had let that decision stand, even when Owen presented him with every reason to revise it. That was not high standards. That was not the demanding pace of a high-functioning life. That was something smaller and considerably less defensible. And Richard Holloway was having his first real encounter with what it actually felt like to know that about himself. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. He moved forward to row 1 and stopped in the aisle beside Owen's seat. Owen looked up and Richard met his eyes, which was harder than he expected it to be. "Carter," he said. His voice came out lower and less certain than it usually did. "I want to say something to you." He did not wait for permission. "What I said to you before we boarded about the understanding in this cabin, about how things work, that wasn't a comment about the seat. You know that. I'm sure you've known it since the moment I said it." He kept his eyes on Owen's face. "I looked at you, and I decided you didn't belong here. I had no basis for that. I had nothing but what you looked like and what I assumed that meant. And I leaned on that assumption hard enough to help get you thrown off an aircraft that you own." The last sentence cost him something visible. "I'm not asking you to do anything with that. I'm not asking for anything. I needed to say it to you directly." Owen set down his pen. He looked at Richard with the same quality of attention he had given Vanessa, full, unhurried, without performance. "I appreciate that," Owen said. "It means something that you said it." Richard nodded once, the kind of nod that has no follow-up, and returned to his seat. The flight continued. The meal service came and went. The cabin settled into the long rhythms of a transatlantic crossing, the dimming of the cabin lights, the gradual retreat of passengers into sleep or films or the private, slightly suspended state of mind that long flights produced. Outside the windows, the sky above the Atlantic was clear enough that the stars were visible, sharp and cold and indifferent. Owen finished the section of documents he had been working through and set the folder on the seat beside him. He leaned back. He was not asleep, but he was resting in the way that people rested when they had decided that the work was done for now and the rest could wait for morning. He had not used the word fired. He had not made a threat implied or explicit. He had not signaled to anyone on board that there would be consequences waiting at the end of this flight, because he had not decided that there would be. What had happened was serious. It would require a response. But the response he was forming was not about Vanessa Reed or Richard Holloway specifically. It was about the system that had made the outcome feel to everyone involved like the correct and natural one. The assumption that had operated in that cabin before pushback was not unique to this flight. It wasn't the product of one judgmental crew member or one entitled frequent flyer. It was the product of an environment where certain signals, clothes, luggage mannerism, the particular confidence that money produced had been allowed to function as a sorting mechanism for who received respect and who received management. That environment did not happen by accident. It was built, maintained, and never sufficiently examined, and it had produced a situation in which a flight attendant with 11 years of experience had looked at a man with a valid ticket and a clear case and found reasons to override both because the man did not match the picture she carried in her head of who belonged in the space. That was the problem Owen intended to address, not with terminations or public accountability measures, but with a comprehensive retraining of every customer-facing team member in the airline's domestic and international operations. Not a half-day module, not a corporate memo, but a full structural program that examined the assumption at its root. Vanessa was in the galley. The flight was 6 hours in, the cabin was mostly asleep, and she had a 40-minute break before the next service pass. She was sitting on the small crew seat, with a cup of coffee going cold beside her, not thinking about what she had done anymore. She had done enough of that, but about what she intended to do with it. The junior crew member she had been working alongside all evening had said something kind to her an hour ago. Something about how even good crew members made mistakes, and what mattered was how you carried them forward. Vanessa had thanked her and meant it, but she also knew that carrying something forward and actually letting it change you were two entirely different things, and she was only interested in the second one. The thing about 11 years was that it had built her into someone genuinely capable, someone who could read a cabin under pressure, manage conflict without escalation, hold a difficult situation together through sheer professional discipline. She did not want to lose that. But she understood now with a clarity that had not been available to her that morning, that somewhere inside that capability, she had also been carrying a set of assumptions she had never once examined, because they had never once cost her anything. They had cost Owen Carter something today. They had cost him his seat, his time, and the particular indignity of being walked off an aircraft he owned while 9 strangers watched in silence. The fact that she had not known who he was made it worse, not better. She had not owed him different treatment because he was powerful. She had owed him the same treatment she gave every other passenger in that cabin, and she had failed that long before his name meant anything at all. She was going to let that stay uncomfortable. Not as punishment, but as information. She was going to carry it into the next flight, and the one after that, and every boarding process that came after this one, and she was going to let it ask her a question each time she made a read on someone. In the first 4 seconds, is this experience, or is this assumption, the answer would not always be easy to find. But she was going to keep asking it. 7 hours into the flight, Owen Carter pressed the call button. Vanessa came to the row. He looked up at her with the same expression she had seen every time, even direct, holding nothing in reserve but demanding nothing either. "When we land," he said, "I'd like to arrange a conversation with the head of your service training team, not to discuss today specifically. I want to talk about building something new, a program for the whole operation customer-facing staff across all routes. I'm going to be spending a lot of time with this airline going forward. I want it to be one that doesn't require its passengers to prove they deserve to be treated well. Vanessa held his gaze. I'll make sure that's arranged, she said. Thank you, Owen said, and returned to his documents. She walked back to the galley and stood for a moment with her hand on the counter, feeling the low hum of the aircraft moving through the metal under her palm. Outside, the Atlantic was somewhere below in the dark. Ahead of them, London was still 2 hours away, sitting in the early gray of a morning that had not yet started. Behind her, the cabin was quiet. The overhead lights dimmed to almost nothing, the passengers in their seats folded into sleep or stillness. Richard Holloway was asleep in row 2, his head tilted slightly toward the window, his expression in sleep unguarded, in a way it had not been while he was awake, less certain and somehow more honestly himself than he had appeared at any point during the boarding process. Whatever he was carrying into that sleep, it would be there when he woke up. That was the nature of what had happened. It did not resolve on landing. It came with you. Owen Carter did not sleep. He read until the cabin lights came back up for the breakfast service, and when the meal arrived, he set the documents aside and ate quietly, and watched the first pale line of light appearing at the edge of the sky outside the window. He did not appear satisfied or vindicated or tired from the weight of what the day had held. He appeared as he always appeared, simply present, a man in a seat on an aircraft, moving through the early morning air above the ocean, doing what he came to do, arriving where he was going. The coastline of England appeared below them 40 minutes later, gray-green and very still in the early light. The captain made the descent announcement. The cabin began its slow return to waking seat belts, tray tables, seat backs, the gradual reassembly of the ordinary. Around them, the world was waiting exactly where they had left it. Nothing about it looked different from the outside. But inside the aircraft, in that specific, pressurized altitude, something had shifted in a way that did not need to announce itself to be real. Some rooms changed without anyone formally deciding that they would. Some things got understood in the air that couldn't be taken back on the ground. The aircraft descended through the cloud cover and broke into the pale morning above Heathrow. Owen Carter looked out the window. He closed the document folder, tucked his pen into his shirt pocket, and waited to land.